This is a made-up narrative inspired on actual case patterns I've researched. Leave a comment with your location. I adore how these stories bring people together from all walks of life. I've spent years researching obscure incidents from America's history, and I've discovered that the most disturbing tales don't always make the news. They are buried in county archives, recounted through the centuries, and concealed in testimonials that defy official documentation. What follows is the culmination of months of investigation into a case that ought to have been forgotten. If it wasn't, that tells you everything. Rappahannock County in Virginia experienced the early arrival of winter, 1929. The last tobacco crops had already been destroyed by frost by the middle of October, and farmers on the eastern slopes of the Blue Ridge Mountains were getting ready for what the almanac said would be a difficult growing season. Though not in the ways they had anticipated, they were correct. The events at the Greylock Estate, a vast property that had lain empty, would be the winter's lasting memory rather than the snow. For about 3 years. Around 8 miles west of Sperryville, the estate covered around 200 acres of undulating Piedmont and was only reachable by a little dirt road that branched off of Route 211. The main building was a Georgian-style house constructed in 1847 by Cornelius Greylock, a tobacco trader from Richmond. 4 generations had lived in the building by 1929, and each one appeared to be less interested in keeping it up than the previous. Locally, the property had gained a reputation not the kind that families brag about. What attracted? I found a number of documents at the Virginia Historical Society in Richmond that caught my attention, a handwritten, unsigned narrative of happenings at the Greylock farm during the winter of 1929-1930 found hidden among a collection of legal correspondence from the 1930s. The story was written in 2 separate hands and was incomplete, indicating that it was produced by numerous authors. I was startled by the clinical accuracy of some aspects compared with lengthy parts that were blatantly omitted, as if the authors were deliberately. They were avoiding something they couldn't specifically identify. I looked for relevant materials for 2 months. Due to a courthouse fire in 1952, much of the county's records from that time period are missing. However, after the estate's final liquidation in 1965, I found a stockpile of personal letters, newspaper clippings from the Rappahannock News, and property transfer paperwork. These correspondences between family members and their Charlottesville lawyer provided evidence that seemed increasingly troubling with every fresh piece of information. Let me lay out the underlying principles. Jasper Whitmore, a lawyer from Baltimore who had just taken a long leave of absence from his career, bought the Greylock estate in November 1929. Whitmore was 43 years old, single, and, based on letters I was able to get, had been looking for what he called a place of rest and contemplation, after experiencing what business acquaintances subtly referred to as professional weariness. The specifics of his ailment. Letters indicate he had been under a lot of stress in his legal profession. However, this is yet unknown. Whitmore wasn't the only one who bought the property. His sister, Opal Whitmore Crane, a 38-year-old widow who had lost her husband to illness 2 years prior, was with him. Luther Pembroke, Jasper's former law partner, and Pembroke's wife, Rowena, also joined them. On November 15, 1929, about 2 weeks after the stock market crisis that would cause the Great Depression. It's unclear if they picked that particular period due to opportunity or necessity. A brief announcement in the Baltimore Sun claimed that they were moving to create a retreat for professional recuperation, but it was never made clear exactly what that meant. I've spoken to locals who are descended from families that lived there at the time, and they recall the Baltimore group's arrival with mistrust and interest. In 1929, Rappahannock County was still mostly. Its population is dispersed over small farms and crossroads communities, making it an agrarian region. There was a lot of conjecture when 4 well-educated city people appeared to be relocating to an empty house. Almost nobody was aware that the Greylock estate had a past that made its 3-year vacancy less than shocking. I learned this from a 1926 deposition provided by Parthenia Hodge, a housekeeper for the final Greylock to live there, a solitary bachelor named Greylock Gregory. Details that the family would have obviously intended to keep private are included in Hodge's testimony, which was provided after a dispute about unpaid wages. To refresh your memory, this narrative is being listened to on the channel The Fear Behind You. Please be advised that this video has been duplicated and uploaded without my permission if you are hearing it from any other channel. If so, I respectfully request that you report it. We appreciate your support of original material. Hodge said that Gregory Greylock had lived. From 1919 until his death in 1926, he lived alone in the manor. He spent his days in the estate library, which took up the whole east wing of the second floor, and she portrayed him as a guy engrossed in what she called odd studies. Greylock had amassed a sizable collection of books and papers, many of which dealt with what Hodges described as historical matters of unusual nature. She observed that he prohibited her from going into specific rooms, especially one in the cellar that he always kept locked. The coroner's report I was able to obtain said that heart failure was the cause of Gregory Greylock's death. Hodge herself discovered him in his study one March morning in 1926. The status of the study when she found him was something Hodge mentioned in her statement, but the coroner's report doesn't address. She reported furniture that had been overturned, documents all over the place, and most worrisome of all, multiple marks on the inside of the study door, as if someone had been frantically attempting to get out, or maybe she recommended keeping anything out. I noticed something strange when I compared this to Greylock's estate inventory. According to Hodge, the library had hundreds of volumes, but the inventory showed that it was largely empty. There was no indication of the sealed selling room she indicated. Either the inventory was not comprehensive, or a significant amount of items had been removed between Greylock's death and the estate's records. The property then remained unoccupied for 3 years, which implies that the family might have had trouble finding a buyer prepared to assume whatever reputation the home had gained. Jasper Whitmore and his friends moved into this property in November 1929. Based on the few records that are accessible, it appears that the first week went off without any problems. Opal Whitmore Crane's November 28th letter to a friend in Baltimore details their early attempts to make. It is livable. She suggests using local contractors to fix the roof, clean the chimneys, and take care of other structural problems. Her voice is upbeat, almost joyful. She writes on the possibilities she sees in the old house, the tranquility of the countryside, and the beauty of the nearby mountains. That tone had shifted by the middle of December. Growing discomfort is revealed in another letter, this one from Rowena Pembroke to her mother in Philadelphia. Jasper had grown more reclusive according to Rowena, and was spending most of his time in Gregory Greylock's former study. She observes that her husband, Luther, appeared fixated by the estate's library after learning that a sizable collection of volumes persisted in spite of the inventory claims. The most telling part of Rowena's story is that she started hearing what she called unusual disturbances at night, sounds that appeared to originate from the walls themselves. At this point, the 4 Sperryville residents started asking questions regarding the history of the estate. A number of residents of the town remembered being contacted by Luther Pembroke or Jasper Whitmore, who inquired about the Greylock family, Gregory specifically, and any strange incidents connected to the property. Locals thought these questions were strange. Years later, a local historian contacted a shopkeeper who recalled Pembroke specifically asking about local disappearances and whether anyone had reported experiencing strange sensations in particular places. What did they want to find? When educated individuals begin questioning locals about disappearances and strange sensations, it usually indicates that they have encountered something they are unable to explain, according to my experience looking into past incidents, and are looking for a framework to comprehend it. It appears that whatever they went through started practically quickly because they were asking these concerns just a month after moving in. Winter grew more severe. Rappahannock County experienced one of the coldest periods in recorded history by the beginning of January 1930. Temperature logs. Several days with temperatures never rising beyond 15 degrees Fahrenheit are shown by data from the Luray weather station, which is located about 20 miles west. The drive to the Greylock estate was nearly impassable due to the accumulation of snow. Practically speaking, the 4 residents were alone. The documentary record gets increasingly thorough and concerning throughout this time. A daily log of January can be found in a journal that Luther Pembroke's daughter found among his belongings in 1963. 1930. Given that it contains remarks on Rowena that imply he was keeping an eye on her behavior without her knowing, it appears that the notebook was kept secret, even from his wife. His entries regarding Jasper, which document a gradual transformation that Pembroke was helpless to stop, are more worrisome. Jasper was discovered in the cellar, standing in front of a door that had not been apparent during earlier inspections, according to Pembroke's record for January 7th. According to Pembroke, he had visited the cellar several times since there. Arrived and knew exactly how everything was laid out. He says that this door had not been visible before. Beyond this door, according to Pembroke, was a descending stairway with stone steps that led down into darkness that his candle was unable to sufficiently illuminate. When he asked Jasper about it, his old companion reportedly just replied, "It was concealed before I found the mechanism." According to his writing, he asked Jasper to leave the area and suggested that they shut the door, but Jasper refused. The entry concludes, "I've read that line countless of times." He claims to hear a calling sound. He claims that ever since we got there, it has been calling. Where was it that was calling? Pembroke does not explain, or maybe was unable to. His latter postings are more and more disjointed, containing observations that appear to be intended to capture the events without providing a clear meaning. He reports that Opal had ceased getting enough sleep on January 10th, saying that sleeping at the house was not possible. He notes that on January 13th, Rowena had started talking to herself, seemingly having conversations with people who weren't there. His entry for January 16th, in which he claims to have just discovered her standing at the top of the main staircase at 3 in the morning, is the most alarming. Waiting for them to finish, was her response when I asked what she was doing. I didn't press her to expand. The inhabitants reportedly maintained sporadic contact with the outside world during this time, albeit with growing restrictions due to the weather and what seemed to be becoming less inclined to leave the property. In January, Cecile Brantley, a Sperryville General Store delivery driver, made 2 trips to the Greylock estate to deliver groceries that had been bought over the phone. He later told the Rappahannock News. His account of these visits is enlightening. Brantley reported that Opal Whitmore Crane, who appeared quite normal, albeit a little nervous, greeted him at the door on his first visit January 4th. She covered the cost of the items and money and courteously thanked him. January 18th, his second visit was very different. Luther Pembroke answered the door this time, and Brantley saw that in barely 2 weeks he seemed to have changed significantly. Pembroke's actions were more worrisome. He spoke in whispers and continued to look back into the house. Brantley said, "We've made an error coming here. A serious error, but it's too late now." Pembroke supposedly responded, We've made an error coming here. An obvious question is raised by Brantley's account. Why didn't they just go away if Pembroke thought they had made a mistake? Although challenging, the roads weren't entirely impassable, and Carr was available to them. Still, they persisted. I've seen this tendency in numerous situations. This perplexing conduct occurs when people acknowledge something troubling yet appear incapable or unwilling to move past it. The financial and emotional resources required can make leaving appear more challenging then. Persistence. The story begins in late January in the fragmentariary written report I referenced before, which is what initially interested me to this case. Although this section's handwriting is shaky and occasionally hard to see, the information is remarkably straightforward. Based on commonalities with her previous letters, I consider the author to be Opal Whitmore Crane. She writes about a meeting that happened in the library on the night of January 24th. This report states that all 4 inhabitants gathered at Jasper's. Insistency. He had been reading the books that had once belonged to Gregory Greylock at the library almost all the time. He asserted that he had found something that explained everything on this specific evening. This claim is repeated throughout the story without ever being completely explained. According to Opal, Jasper seemed both ecstatic and extremely distressed. The mix unnerved her. Evidently, Jasper had found a number of journals written by the house's former residents, going all the way back to its 1847 construction. These journals, which had been concealed in the library shelving behind false panels, detailed events that were very comparable to what the present occupants were going through. Sounds, doors that came and went, and senses that seemed to change in strange ways are all mentioned. The most alarming were the numerous references to the archive below, a phrase that surfaced in several publications across several decades. According to Opal, Jasper's theory was that the house had been constructed on a site with unique features that the previous builder, Cornelius Greylock, had somehow been aware of and wanted to look into. Luther had found the descending stairway and the locked apartment in the cellar. These were unique characteristics created for a purpose the journals alluded to but never made clear. They weren't later additions. Gregory Greylock, in Jasper's opinion, had been trying to carry on the task his ancestor had started, and his death had resulted from moving forward too. Far away. After this, it gets harder and harder to follow the account. According to Opal, Luther and Jasper argue, with Luther demanding that they depart right away and Jasper objecting, saying that it would be worse to stay than to leave now. Why would it be worse to leave? It's not stated in the account. Rather, Opal writes about hearing noises in the middle of the night, footsteps outside her chamber, and incomprehensible whispers. She says Rowena had stopped talking, completely, sitting there in the drawing room all day, staring at nothing. In Opal's handwriting, the last entry is dated February 2nd. There are just a few lines in it, and Jasper is down the stairs. He promised to return before dawn and took a lantern. But I pleaded with Luther not to accompany him. We're holding out. It's really peaceful in the house. At this time, the second handwriting takes over, most likely that of Luther Pembroke, though it's hard to tell because of how inconsistent the style is. This piece, which is dated February 4th, details what happened after Jasper's fall. Jasper did not return before daybreak, according to this report. He never came back that day or the following. In spite of Opal's cries for help, Luther writes on the third day that he could no longer stand the uncertainty and went down the cellar stairs by himself. He tries to explain what he discovered below, but the words don't appear to be sufficient. He describes a room that is enormous and much bigger than the foundation of the home ought to have permitted. He talks about walls that have traces on them that could have been writing or something else entirely. He claims that although Jasper was present and standing in the middle of the room, he did not answer Luther's summons. Luther drew nearer and saw that his ex-partner seemed motionless, yet nevertheless stayed erect. Here, the handwriting about accumulating moments and perception settling dissolves into bits, making the report all but unreadable. Luther asserts that he swiftly left and returned to the main house, where he discovered Rowena still sitting still in the drawing room and Opal in a distressed state. The account's last lines, which are written in a different ink, imply that they were added later and only. The next morning, we set out. The cellar's door was shut. We haven't discussed this with anyone. We won't talk to anyone. The documentation trail should come to an end here, and the case should become one of those annoying historical mysteries that will never be solved. Completely described. However, there is a continuation that I had to work hard to find. The Greylock estate was destroyed by fire in March 1930, about a month after the events detailed. According to the Rappahannock News, there was an accident that was probably caused by a malfunctioning chimney or possibly lightning, though the latter seems improbable considering the season. Due to distance and inadequate roads, the Sperryville Fire Department arrived long after the building had been destroyed to its stone. Foundation. According to a brief story, a group from Baltimore had recently moved into the property, but they left because of the challenging winter weather before to the fire. When firefighters finally arrived at the scene and surveyed the remains, they discovered something that severely upset them. This information was only revealed to me through private correspondence preserved by a descendant of the fire chief. It was not reported in the media. Even though everything above it had been destroyed by the extreme heat, the cellar was, in some way, undamaged. It looked more than undamaged, as though the flames had merely ceased at the ground. Horace Dennison, the fire chief, claimed in a letter to a friend that he and 2 of his men went into the cellar and discovered the closed door that Luther Pembroke had stated, even though Dennison was obviously unaware of this. Dennison opened the door against what he subsequently acknowledged was his better judgment. They discovered the descending staircase behind it. According to reports, one of the men with Dennison declined to go, further asserting that he felt uneasy about something from underneath. Dennison himself went down around 20 steps when, as he put it, the atmosphere changed in a way I cannot adequately describe. He pivoted. Dennis claims in his letter that they used debris from the demolished house to block the cellar's access. He suggested to the county that the land be condemned and never rebuilt. Apparently, this advice was heeded. According to records, the land was unoccupied until a development bought it in 1952. Business that planned to divide the property. Before any work was completed, that company filed for bankruptcy within a year. Before being eventually purchased by the National Park Service in 1968 as part of the extension of Shenandoah National Park and the 4 inhabitants, the land passed through 2 additional owners. It was difficult to track their fates, but I eventually figured out what happened to each. Luther Pembroke and his wife Rowena went back to Baltimore. He never went back to practicing law. Records indicate that he died in 1956. Despite this, his obituary notes that his health had been deteriorating for a long time. In a private institution in Pennsylvania, Rowena lived out the rest of her life before passing away in 1948. Her condition's nature was never made public. After 1930, Opal Whitmore Crane vanished from the public domain. A letter from a distant relative in 1935 mentioned that Opal was living in the country, but it didn't specify where. That was the only mention of her that I could find. If she is interred in Baltimore alongside other. I haven't been able to identify family members. There are gaps in the cemetery records from that time period. Regarding Jasper Whitmore, here is where the narrative takes its most unsettling turn. 3 years after the events at the Greylock estate, in 1933, a surveyor working on a land assessment found bones in the cellar ruins. Identification was challenging due to the extensive decay of the remains. However, personal items discovered nearby, such as a pocket watch with a monogram, suggested. Was Jasper. Several oddities regarding the discovery were recorded in the county coroner's report, which I was able to get with considerable effort. Since the time span was far more advanced than 3 years would have allowed, the degeneration was erratic. Observations regarding the location and state of the surrounding area, which suggested unique circumstances, were more worrisome. Instead of a professional observation, the coroner's report ends with an odd note of personal comment. The circumstances surrounding this discovery raise a number of unexplained issues that want more thought, but I don't think that will happen anytime soon. In Speeville, Jasper Whitmore was interred in an unmarked spot. A funeral service was not held. The remains were not claimed by the family, or what was left of it. In the fall of 2018, I went to the site of the former Greylock estate. In Shenandoah National Park, there is now a hiking track, but you wouldn't know anything had ever been there unless you glanced closely. If you know what to look for, you can still see the foundation. 70 years of forest growth have hidden the rectangular impressions in the ground. I walked the region for several hours, attempting to make sense of the events that had taken place there, while still appreciating the serene beauty of the Blue Ridge Mountains. What actually transpired throughout that winter of 1929 to 1930? I've been thinking about it for months, and I'll admit that none of the explanations quite satisfy me. According to the conservative view, put everything down to group stress, which may have been brought on by Jasper's precarious condition and made worse by the harsh surroundings, loneliness, and suggestible atmosphere of an ancient mansion with a bad history. The stories might be fabrications, exaggerations, or even intentional fabrications meant to hide something less dramatic, but no less regrettable. However, some physical evidence is not taken into consideration by this theory. The state of Jasper's bones, the seller who made it through the fire, the uniformity of reports from several sources that were not in communication. Furthermore, the historical pattern points to something that goes beyond personal perspective. Something unique to that place, something that existed before the whites and continued after their departure, is suggested by the notebooks Jasper purportedly found, which span decades of residents recounting identical occurrences. I've thought about the surroundings. Is it possible that the region had unique geology? Possibly peculiar mineral deposits, or subterranean water flows that could have produced psychological or even oral consequences. It has been demonstrated that infrasound, or frequencies below normal hearing, produced by some types of rock formations, can induce uneasiness and even alter perception. The specifics of what was stated, the constancy of the experiences, and the physical evidence that is still present, however, cannot be explained by this. I approach the alternative possibility with a great deal of hesitancy. What if, more precisely, the house? Did the place contain properties that we just don't have the right frameworks to comprehend? Not mystically supernatural, yet functioning on a different set of principles than our present models. There are many examples throughout history that were thought to be impossible until we acquired the knowledge and understanding necessary to understand them. Is it possible that certain parts of perception and space function differently in different situations? Circumstances that could have prevailed in that particular place. I get how this sounds. I'm a researcher who has been trained to rely on logical analysis and reliable evidence. But you're left with uncomfortable concerns after spending as much time studying this case as I have, holding the documents, walking the ground, and trying every traditional explanation that turns out to be inadequate. questions concerning the boundaries of human knowledge and whether there are any situations in which the standard frameworks might not be entirely applicable. I am more troubled by one detail than any other. Something found in the chamber beneath the cellar is mentioned in the surveyor's report from 1933, which led to the discovery of Jasper's remains. The surveyor, who was ostensibly ignorant of the history of the area, described walls covered in marks he was unable to identify. As he descended, he noticed that these scars appeared to persist, as though the chamber went much deeper than was realistic. Given the terrain of the area, he recorded distances that were mathematically unlikely. Region. His observation regarding duration was the most alarming. He claims that he was in the lower chamber for about 20 minutes. But when he came out and looked at his pocket watch, more than 3 hours had passed. Although he pointed out that his watch had been accurately recording the time both before and after the incident, he ascribed this to it malfunctioning. Within a week of his report, his advice to permanently seal the site was put into action. Yes, the area was sealed. I can't say how fully, though. I searched for any indication of the cellar entry during my 2018 visit, but I couldn't find anything. Either the park administration has purposefully hidden it, or decades of soil and plant have entirely covered it. When I asked park officials about the site's history, they firmly but respectfully informed me that they didn't have any information beyond the most basic property records. I'm not sure if this is the result of intentional restraint or a true lack of knowledge. I've often considered what. When Jasper Whitmore came down those steps for the last time, he may have been looking for something. Was he researching, running away, or was he drawn by an irresistible force that overpowered his better judgment? His past points to someone who has already gone through what his colleagues referred to as weariness and was under a lot of professional stress. He might have been more susceptible to influences that others might have resisted in that vulnerable state. Or maybe he found something that clarified his prior symptoms. Something that implied his episodes were reactions to perceptions that others couldn't share rather than stress-related issues at all. Though it's just conjecture, it's something to think about. What if certain people are more sensitive to specific aspects of their surroundings, and what is commonly understood to be stress symptoms are actually responses to stimuli that we are not yet aware of? I also consider what Luther, Opal, and Rowena carried with them for the remainder of their lives. According to Luther's journal, he held himself responsible for failing to stop Jasper's decline and for not realizing the problem sooner. After 1930, Opal remained silent, a sign of something too profound to discuss. Furthermore, Rowena's institutionalization is a sign of irreversible harm. These were capable, well-educated individuals who made decisions that had a significant impact on them. It appears that comprehending the reasons behind their decisions and their decision to stay in that house in spite of growing concerns is essential to comprehending the case at hand. I've come across other reports of comparable phenomena while researching this story, but none are as well documented as the Greylock case. Local histories contain references to places where perception changes, or where structures have unexpected spaces, which are typically written off as folklore or exaggeration. These reports, which cover various places and eras, point to a trend that merits more careful examination than is usually given to it. What sets the Greylock case apart is the source's quality. Stories were not being told by superstitious locals. These were professionals, lawyers, and well-educated citizens whose written testimonies show logical minds finding it difficult to make sense of experiences that were beyond their comprehension. People attempting to apply reason to something that defied rational analysis can be seen in their attempts to document what was happening, find historical context, and find explanations. The house was destroyed by fire in. I still find March 1930 suspicious. Intentionality is suggested by the timing, which was only a month after the residents left, and just before the surveyor found Jasper's remains. Who would have said it, though, and why? Was someone trying to hide something they were afraid might come to light, or perhaps to destroy evidence? The cellar's survival implies that if the fire was intentional, it was started by someone who either didn't know about the cellar or wasn't brave enough to approach it. I've attempted to find any living family members of the four principals, as they may have records or anecdotes that could help clarify the case. The woman who discovered Luther Pembroke's journal in 1963, his daughter died in 1997. When I spoke with her grandson, he recalled that she had mentioned his grandfather's involvement in a troubling matter, but she would not go into specifics. He remembered that after discovering the journal, she had destroyed the majority of her father's papers, preserving only a few that appeared harmless. The journal itself, which she reportedly found extremely troubling, was anonymously given to a historical society. That's how I found it in the end. There were no descendants of Jasper Whitmore. I have not been able to find any records of Opal Whitmore Crane's daughter from her previous marriage after 1940. As far as I can tell, Rowena Pembroke's family deliberately avoided talking about her, viewing her illness and institutionalization as a personal matter rather than something worthy of compassion or understanding. This pattern of deliberate forgetting and silence is instructive in and of itself. It implies that people who were aware of the whole story decided to bury it rather than take the chance of the question it might raise, indicating that knowledge of these events was difficult. The survivor's actions would have seemed unfathomable in a time before our current understanding of stress and perception, possibly even endangering accepted social norms. I have one last document to complete. Mention, one that has proven difficult for me to understand. A group of surveyors carried out a comprehensive evaluation of the land in 1965 as it was being prepared for Park Service acquisition. A brief note regarding the cellar area is included in their report, which I was able to obtain through a Freedom of Information request. According to the surveyor, they found cavities that extended to unusual depths and followed geometrically irregular patterns, which are structural anomalies beneath the surface. Citing unidentified stability concerns, he advised against any excavation or construction in that area. This notation is noteworthy because it includes a handwritten comment in the margin that appears to have been added by the person who reviewed the report. Concur with the recommendation area to remain undisturbed per prior directive. The prior directive is referenced but not explained, and my attempts to locate it through official channels have been unsuccessful. Someone at some level of authority had already determined that this site should not be investigated further. That directive was issued before the 1965 survey and seems to still be in force, though I'm not sure if anyone who works for the Park Service today is even aware of it. As I stood there in 2018, surrounded by the tranquil sounds of the forest, I tried to picture what Jasper Whitmore went through on his last descent of those stairs. According to the account, he thought he was seeking understanding, and that the journals and documents he found had indicated something important about the location and character of the house. However, comprehension can be difficult when it surpasses our ability to safely process it. Maybe he found what he was looking for. Maybe that's exactly the problem. 3 years after his death, the coroner noted circumstances that seemed out of the ordinary. What could lead to such situations? What could keep them going for years? There are only uncomfortable answers to these questions. Implications regarding the boundaries of human endurance in the face of specific awareness types. I have shared my findings with a number of colleagues in the field of historical research, and their reactions have been conflicting. Some people are intrigued by the case and wish there was more evidence. Others have voiced doubts about the source's veracity, speculating that the stories might have been made up or embellished. I really respect one of my coworkers, and she suggested that I was seeing patterns. Where none existed, that the different documents I had put together reflected my own attempt to make sense of disparate pieces rather than necessarily forming a cohesive story. This critique is legitimate and deserving of attention. Have I put together a narrative out of disparate parts? Have I become blind to more commonplace explanations because of my fascination with the unusual? I can't completely ignore the questions I've asked myself over and over. Balance is necessary for research. Between retaining critical skepticism and being receptive to surprising discoveries. Maybe I've leaned too much in the direction of the former. However, I keep coming back to the conclusion that something truly strange happened at the Greylock estate during that winter of 1929-1930, when I go over the timeline, follow the links between the events, and take into account the physical evidence that is still there. I'm not sure if it can be explained by mechanisms we now understand, or if it calls for frameworks we haven't yet created. However, I continue to believe that it is a disservice to those who witnessed it and chronicled it at great personal expense to write it off as a figment of imagination or perception. The case calls into question how we should handle historical narratives that don't neatly fit into preconceived notions. Well-educated, psychologically healthy people report unlikely encounters. As researchers, what are our responsibilities? Do we reject their stories because they don't fit our conception of what is feasible? Or do we accept them as facts that raise the possibility that our knowledge is lacking? Although I am aware of the dangers of credulity, I tend to gravitate toward the latter. Not every strange story is worth looking into, and not every mystery has an answer just waiting to be found. However, some cases, such as the Greylock estate, offer sufficient reliable evidence from sufficient independent sources to merit careful study, even if doing so puts us in uncomfortable situations. When I'm feeling down, I wonder what the locked cellar underneath. Remnants of the foundation. What would happen, I wonder, if someone dug down there to descend those stairs that might still be there under decades of accumulated dirt and rubble? Would the room Luther Pembroke describes be there? Would the surveyor's recorded temporal alterations affect them? Would they come out altered, just as the Pembrokes and Whitmores were altered? Or would they never come out? These ideas bother me because, despite the obvious hazards, I have a part of me that wants to know and wants to learn more. Jasper Whitmore went down those stairs because he wanted to comprehend, even if it meant defying comprehension. It's what motivates scientists to push the envelope, often at great expense. Even though I acknowledge that his urge had a significant impact on him, I can understand it. However, I also know that some boundaries are in place for reasons we might not fully understand. We might not be prepared to deal with the ramifications of some understanding. The Greylock case's pattern of silence, the attempts to forget rather than. A communal wisdom regarding boundaries that should not be crossed may be reflected in the investigation. I've provided what I know about this case to preserve the record of what transpired, rather than to offer conclusive solutions, as I don't have any. The records I've mentioned are dispersed over a number of archives, many of which are institutional holdings or private collections with limited access. By compiling them together and presenting them as a cohesive story, I'm making sure that Jasper Whitmore's story doesn't completely vanish, and his friends are not overlooked. I can't tell if researchers in the future will expand on this work or write it off as the fixation of someone who discovered meaning where none existed. What I can say is that the examination has altered my perspective on the nature of historical research, the boundaries of traditional explanation, and the potential that our perception and comprehension of space may be more tentative than we usually recognize. The estate of Greylock is disappeared, reduced to barely perceptible traces in the soil of the forest. The testimony of those who encountered its secrets are incomplete and dispersed. They have all passed away. Whatever it contains is still in the seller's possession, sealed beneath the dirt and administrative directive. Uncertain and frightening, the story continues. A reminder that some historical occurrences defy classification and explanation. As you hike through Shenandoah National Park and come upon the area where the estate used to be, you can stop and think about what took place there about a century ago. Like me, you may worry about the location's character and whether the properties that made it worrisome have really been neutralized by blocking off the entry and allowing time to pass. You may experience, as I did when I was there, a subtle uneasiness that has no apparent cause, a feeling that there are depths beneath your feet that we haven't yet plumbed and maybe shouldn't. However, these are merely perceptions, the kinds of atmospheric reactions that any place can arouse someone with a troubled past. They don't prove anything. They imply everything. They leave us stuck between skepticism and wonder, between logical explanation and the unsettling prospect that our frameworks for comprehending reality might not be sufficient for the job, much like the Greylock case actually does. I keep looking at cases like this to record narratives that are often ignored or disregarded by traditional history. I learn something from every instance regarding the intricacy of the human experience about the gaps between our knowledge and our perceptions of it. One such area, a knowledge gap that might never be completely filled, is the Greylock estate. The encounter was unquestionably real and significantly changed the lives of all who experienced it, including Luther, Rowena, Jasper, and Opal. No matter what transpired in that house during those winter months, the markings were permanent. Their subsequent silence and refusal to talk about what they had experienced speak louder than any. They may have provided an explanation. Even as I work to fill it with documentation and research, I respect that quiet. Some experiences might never be fully conveyed because they are too profound, too personal, or too difficult to describe. They left behind bits of written accounts, glimpses of something more expansive that they were unable to completely express. I have more questions than answers as I wrap up this inquiry, at least for the time being. Which journals did Jasper have? Found? In reality, what did they say? Which archive was mentioned by several generations of residents below? What happened to Jasper in the 3 years between his descent and the finding of his remains is the most concerning question of all. According to the official story, he stayed in the cellar until he was discovered in 1933. However, this begs the question of how someone might survive in that environment for 3 years. The possibility that he departed and came back, or the idea that the timeline itself is flawed in some way, leads to a number of impossibilities. Maybe some questions aren't supposed to have answers. Maybe the value is in asking, in admitting that our knowledge has boundaries, and that those boundaries may be deeper than we usually acknowledge, rather than in finding a solution. One of those boundaries is reached in the Greylock instance, a tale that defies simple interpretation and cozy conclusions. I've accomplished my goal. Maintain the documentation, put together the pieces, give the evidence in the clearest possible way. In the end, it is up to you to decide whether you consider it to be historical interest or something more important. I've discussed my viewpoint, my months of investigation, and my slow conclusion that this case doesn't fit the patterns I'm used to seeing. The Greylock estate serves as a reminder to me that human experience transcends boundaries set by our current frameworks, and that there are secrets in the past that we may never fully unravel. Have trouble mapping. It's still unclear if those areas are environmental, psychological, or something else entirely. There is no doubt that when 4 individuals walked into that house in November 1929, what they experienced there permanently altered them. Their narrative should be remembered as a tribute to the complexity of human experience and the boundaries of our comprehension, rather than as a warning or a riddle to be solved. As we commemorate them, we recognize that there are gaps in history, such as in geography, which are still unknown and possibly unexplorable. One such location is the Greylock Estate. Another is the cellar underneath it, which is still locked after all these years. I have no say in whether or not it should be kept sealed. However, I hope that anyone who decides to look into this further does so well cognizant of what happened to others who looked into it before them. Until then, the narrative is still unfinished, a piece of history that won't be completely included into our comprehension of the previous. And maybe that's how things ought to be. It's not necessary to solve every riddle. Not all inquiries require a response. Some tales are happy to remain eerie and ambiguous reminders that there is more to the world than we can readily comprehend. One such tale is the winter of 1929-1930 at the Greylock Estate. I've told you what I know. The remainder sits in silence in unmarked graves and sealed chambers, in records that allude to more than they disclose, in memories never fully expressed. That final quiet might be the most truthful illustration of what truly